Hi, I'm Gary Zacharias. You're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. What do you think awaits us on the other side of death? That's probably the key question of life. How we answer that makes a huge difference in how we live our lives, doesn't it? Well, there's a book out that has a new title. I'm going to give you the old title and the new title. I've done a couple of previous podcasts on it. The book is by Gary Habermas and J.P. Moreland, two distinguished professors. The original title, and if you're looking for it as a used book, you may find it this way, Immortality, the Other Side of Death. It's now called Beyond Death. So the book came out, it's been out for quite a while. It came out 30 plus years ago. And I don't know if the new one, or at least the new title, Beyond Death, includes any changes in it. But I've covered NDEs, near-death experiences. That was one chapter. Fascinating work on what people have experienced when they're really close to death and then they've come back. Did a podcast on hell. They talk about hell. I wanted to do chapter 8 called Reincarnation. Is it true? So have you thought about that at all? A lot of people believe in it. In fact, they start off by saying there's a Gallup poll survey that showed almost 1 in 4 Americans believe in reincarnation. Now, what's interesting about that, they didn't gather that from talking to people who are followers of Eastern religions. That was among Western Protestants and Catholics. Wow. So what are we talking about with reincarnation? Well, Habermas and Moreland say the definition basically is the belief that sometime after death, the soul or life force, whatever you want to call it, passes into another body before its birth. And why? Why does this go on? The goal is spiritual evolution. The more popular presentations of belief in reincarnation appeal for their justification to all sorts of things. In other words, why do they think it's happened? Why do they think it's true? Well, things like deja vu. Like we say, gosh, I feel like I've been here before. And they also say some people have reported dealing with hypnotized people who regress to what they call past lives. So they said, here comes a following case reported by Ian Stevenson. He's a medical doctor. He's probably the world's leading expert on reincarnation. So there's a 4-year-old boy named Prakesh. He began declaring that his actual name was Nirmal and that he really lived in another village. He came up with details about his real family, like the names of relatives and friends, what the family did as their business. He kept trying to run away to his prior home, and he talked about it all the time and drove his parents nuts, and they beat him for his behavior. So 5 years later, the father went to that village, and Nirmal's father visited Prakesh's village, and Prakesh recognized him. It was discovered Nirmal was actually the name of the man's son who had died prior to Prakesh's birth. So Prakesh wanted to go back to the family that he said he knew in his previous existence. So Stevenson listed 34 things that Prakesh remembered, and then he verified them by talking to the relevant people, and his memory checked out, even though members of both families said they had no prior knowledge of each other. So both Habermas and Moreland say that's one kind of evidence for reincarnation. It's memories of people who have claimed to live another life at some earlier time. And sometimes these memories can be produced spontaneously, or they can be done through hypnosis. Another kind of evidence that they say people will refer to is called xenoglossy. That's individuals who can speak a language they really don't know. And a third category of evidence comes from the presence of things like birthmarks and deformities in a reincarnated person that match the deceased person. Fourth kind of evidence, this is now Stevenson arguing, not Habermas and Moreland. They're saying here are the evidences that people will put forth. So the fourth one comes from an agreement between a living child's character and that of the individual person who had died. And the fifth category concerns Christianity and the Bible. So some people who believe in reincarnation argue it's actually in the Bible, or at least it's compatible with Christian tenets. So they said, we don't think those things establish reincarnation. Let's see why. So here comes their response to reincarnation. So Habermas and Moreland now are going to take it on. They said the heart of the issue is pretty simple. Are there hypotheses other than reincarnation that could account for the same data. And one person, guess who? Ian Stevenson, the guy that believes in reincarnation, he thinks there is one rival option that should be taken seriously: possession of the living person by a foreign spirit. In both kinds of possession, either the demonic or the deceased human spirit could explain the kind of memories like the Prakash had. So maybe a possibility. Stevenson thinks that the similarities are so close at several points that it said it's very hard to tell between reincarnation and possession. So Stevenson says reincarnation is where another personality enters a body between conception and birth, whereas possession is where an entry by some kind of non-fleshly personality intrudes inside a person sometime after embryonic development. Other pro-reincarnation researchers are pretty serious about this demonic possibility. So it's at least possible, they said, that Eastern religions like Hinduism, just because of their very nature and practice, invite demonic possession. And other reincarnation critics agree possession is a possibility. But how can we really be dogmatic? They said about the differences between possession behavior and reincarnation behavior. Do we know enough about each? He says if another personality or spirit has enough control to speak through a child and give a lot of information there, would controlling the behavior and emotions and mannerisms be much more difficult? No, probably not. They said the most difficult issue is this: if one prefers the possibility of some kind of demonic possession, why wouldn't the other person be genuinely excited to see his old loved ones and friends? In other words, it would seem quite proper that the appropriate emotions would follow naturally from that situation. So they said, in short, researchers and theorists have not proved that these cases demand reincarnation. They have not really established their claim, since demonic possession is a not positive, that's not the word I want to use, but at least is a possible alternative. So I said, if pre-birth spirit entries are termed reincarnation, why can't possession also occur before birth? And they said, on the other hand, if reincarnation happens after birth, it would involve the invasion of a body that already had a spirit. Now, that sounds like, again, some kind of demonic possession. Then they have another section they call more problems for reincarnation. It says, consider the problem of verification. If there's no evidence, then why believe it? But if there are findings, the person claiming to have lived the past life could have discovered this data in the same way the researcher did, maybe by hearing it from someone else. Another problem is the testimony is pretty casual. It says, why is it assumed, both by the person who's experienced it and the researcher, that if somebody remembers details of a past life, therefore it has to be that person's past life? How do you jump from that? So all the person's recollection shows is that this person has knowledge of another person who once lived. I mean, I get that. I mean, for example, I could probably come up with some general statements about George Armstrong Custer, the man who died at the Battle of Little Bighorn. I mean, I could come up with a few things, but that doesn't mean I am him. It just means that I had some knowledge of him. Well, there's another problem. Is it really compatible with Christianity? Well, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, where resurrection is the afterlife model, God is personal. He's active. And history is one of his arenas of his domain. But in the reincarnation model, God is usually thought of as impersonal and passive, and so there's not much room for miraculous intervention in history. And dualism, right, that's a key tenet of Christianity, that we are a body, but we're also a soul, is the best model for the nature of people. But most Eastern views, except monism, right, that we're one, we don't have a split between body and mind. Virtually all Eastern perspectives put down the self and human personality, and that's contrary to Christian teachings. So, plus, look at what reincarnationists accept. They accept karma. That holds that the actions in your earlier lives affects your future life. Well, Christianity says we live once, we die, then we live again in another state, never to be reborn, and repeat the process. And the karma doctrine is the opposition to the Bible's idea of grace and mercy. I mean, think about that. I'm so grateful. Our past acts that we've done can be forgiven, and their effects can be minimized and even eliminated. So he says there are some huge differences, worldview differences between these Eastern religions and Christianity. You can't reconcile them. So they said, in previous chapters, we've walked you through argumentation on dualism, the fact that we have a body and a soul or consciousness, the resurrection of Jesus, the truthfulness of Jesus' message, to show that there's a lot of evidence in favor of Christian theism. And they said that's it'll be a strong opposition to the Eastern message of reincarnation. They said Christianity has the upper hand. The evidence supports its validity. All right, they said, how about another problem with the reincarnation? Many researchers think the data used to support reincarnation can be accounted for by telepathy or ESP, extrasensory perception. But that doesn't seem to be the case, right? Lots of information about the past can be gathered apart from reincarnation. So that would probably account for some of that data that is used to support reincarnation. Well, what about xenoglossy, right, where you can speak a language that you don't know? They said, well, obviously possession by a demonic spirit would apply there. And plus, there's something called cryptomnesia, or sometimes spelled cryptoamnesia, and that occurs where individuals forget information they learned, but later on they can recall it. They just don't remember where they got it. So that's interesting. Both speaking and thinking, they said, are generally formulated in terms of your language. So you could forget such a mainstay of one's existence while lesser points are remembered. That seems pretty unlikely. So what about birthmarks and deformities? Yeah, but they said, no, similarity doesn't prove sameness. Possession could be the answer there as well. Now, they said besides Bible passages that contradict reincarnation, there are theological and philosophical and moral teachings that oppose it. The whole Bible is against it. The Bible teaches resurrection, not reincarnation. It teaches an active personal God, not a passive impersonal force. It teaches grace and mercy, not that law of karma that has no grace and mercy to it. Well, they also have a couple more things that they cover here. They call it some lesser but significant objections. One, they said they brought in the idea of cryptoamnesia. Human beings consciously forget much of what they learn, then later on they recall it. They said it could account for some hypnosis phenomena. It could be where you're speaking another language, and sometimes memories of the past, even like deja vu. Here's a second problem, they said, the cultural conditioning that's involved in reincarnation research. So that Stevenson that we mentioned at the beginning here, he's a real expert in reincarnation. He studies it. But the cases that he used came from India, Alaska, Ceylon, Brazil, and Lebanon. Now, think about those areas, as Habermas and Moreland point out. They have already a strong belief in reincarnation in many of those areas that could explain people being conditioned and having unconscious effects on their quote-unquote objective research data. They say that suggestive adults could play a large part in prejudicing children toward certain beliefs. It says, in fact, why would most of the subjects in these reports be children? They're probably the most suggestive of people. And even Stevenson himself acknowledged this issue. So he says that strong belief in reincarnation in locations where the data are frequently gathered sometimes affects the reporting. Here's a third response to the reincarnation idea. The data is not raw enough. Too much time can allow unconscious contamination of the findings. So the absence of written information prior to the investigation, the unreliability of memories and perception, the general lack of neutral observation, and the average gap of 3 to 5 years between the initial symptoms and the publicity make them kind of critical, right, and scratching their heads going, well, wait a minute, there's some problems there. And Stevenson even acknowledged some of those points. Here's another problem with reincarnation, that hypnosis deal, the idea that you put somebody under and then you regress them. So patients frequently wish to oblige the request of the hypnosis. They want evidence of their past lives to make the person who's doing this to them to perform for them, right? Make them feel good about it. And it says even Stevenson agrees with that. So it said we commend Stevenson for disregarding hypnosis. And it said, finally, there's a set of moral questions that come out with reincarnation. It said, many are bothered by the implications of karmic theory and its repercussions. So, is there real honest continuity where I gain or lose based on my perceived actions in past times, especially since most people don't recall this continuity, at least not very clearly? Yeah. So by what stretch of the imagination is that future incarnation me? Moreover, they said, what does karma say about people who've suffered greatly? Are they all terrible people? Should we accept the caste system like you see in India and other forms of social injustice on the basis of this hypothesis? In other words, hey, they're suffering in this life. Well, that's fine. That's what they're supposed to do because they're making up for bad choices in the past. Karma really encourages moral procrastination. Why would you go help somebody? They're just in the middle of their karma, and you don't want to get involved in that. Why should good karma survive more than bad karma? Why should good karma be commended at all? That's made me think about karma as well. You know, I always think if the point, first of all, if there is karma, who's running karma? Right? I mean, where is this karma machine that takes in all the stuff we do and then assigns us the next life? How does that happen? There's no God to do this, right? There's got to be some kind of force. So what runs karma? And secondly, why aren't we getting better and better as a society, as a human race? Because if we've made terrible sins in the past and then we've kind of recognized them, we're trying to lead better lives, seems like the world should be on an upward spin, right? We're doing better and better, but we aren't. We're just as full of terrible events and terrible things that we've done as in the past. Okay, and it said the last possibility, there's fraud. And there's a famous Bridey Murphy episode. So I wanted to spend just a couple minutes on that because that's interesting. You may have heard that story before. B-R-I-D-E-Y, Bridey Murphy. So under hypnosis, there was a woman named Ruth Simmons, and she supposedly regressed to 19th century Ireland. So in the 1800s, she said she lived there and she was named Bridey Murphy. And it was reported she spoke Gaelic. She came up with a deep Irish accent. She had all sorts of details concerning customs and geography, about her home, about her church. They made a movie out of it. The books came out. And then they had an intense investigation. But here's the catch, well, at least one catch. The parish records where she claimed to have lived revealed no such person as Bridey Murphy. And the church she said she had attended wasn't even built until 100 years after her birth. And then they found out later on, for a while, she had lived with her Irish grandmother who taught her Gaelic, and that grandmother spoke with a heavy Irish brogue. She told her granddaughter tales of the old country. And here's another catch. One of Simmons' next-door neighbors was named, are you ready? Bridey Murphy. Now, so a few people are going to charge conscious fraud, but that obviously was not a case of reincarnation. So the verdict, as they wrap up the chapter, they said possession, right? Demonic possession, some kind of spiritual possession, does a better job explaining some of these cases. And on the other hand, reincarnation wasn't possible in some of those cases. But they said it's certainly debatable if any case of reincarnation could ever be proven due to the possibility that possession could account for some of these pre-birth examples of a spirit entering another person's body. And they said, there's a strange twist to our conclusion. Even though there's no evidence, they say, for reincarnation, our discussion still produced another sort of consideration in favor of an afterlife. Why? Because there's at least evidence for the possession of a body by another spirit. So it kind of advocates that there's a spirit world out there somewhere where life continues after death. Yeah. So that seems to ruin the whole idea of naturalism that says this world, what you can see and measure and weigh, that's all there is. It says that makes that even less likely. But if spirits exist and can enter and direct bodies, that's another support for dualism, that we are two beings. We have an immaterial part and we have a physical part. And they said both of these points make life after death an even more likely fact. So that's the book. I think you would like it. Some of it's tough going, but you can see by doing this chapter, I thought it was pretty easy. And so it's called Beyond Death now, or if you look at the old One's called Immortality, the other side of death. So I find that really fascinating material there. Well, thank you for being part of this podcast, and hope things are going well for you.